This year, more people tuned in to watch the Women's Championship than the Men's Championship for the first time ever. And the audience was greater than many recent events, such as every game of the 2023 World Series and 2023 NBA Finals. And throughout the 2024 season, most of the best scorers in D1 basketball were women, with 3 of the top 5 three-point shooters being women and 3 of the top 5 leaders in points scored this season being women. And Caitlin Clark specifically broke the record for most points ever scored in Division I history by a man or woman. And currently, the Indiana Fever have sold more Caitlin Clark jerseys in 1 week than the entire Dallas Cowboys team sold all of last season. But it would be a disservice to say this happened overnight. So let's take a look back to see how we got here. Now, before we jump in, here is an outline with timestamps of what I'll be discussing today. Now, women's basketball has been around since the late 1800s and was created by this lady. During that time, women were not able to vote, own property, or even have legal rights to their own children. Furthermore, prior to 1870, activities for women were more so recreational in nature, in the sense that they were non-competitive and informal. So when she was creating the rules for women's basketball, she decided girls should not be allowed to snatch the ball, hold it for more than 3 seconds, or dribble it more than 3 times. This was her way of hoping to prevent a young lady from developing, quote, dangerous nervous tendencies and losing the grace and dignity and self-respect we would all have her foster. This all sounds crazy for today's standards, but at the time this was actually quite progressive. She connected her desire for women to be able to play basketball as a way for girls to develop endurance to prove to men that they deserve equal work wages. Mind you, all of this was happening years before our girl Rosie entered the picture. Now, with the first women's intercollegiate basketball game taking place on April 4th in the year 1896 between Stanford and the University of California, about 700 people were in the audience, and they were actually all women, because men were banned for modesty's sake, but they still tried to find a way to watch. So the women inside were said to fend them off with sticks. If you were wondering who won, Stanford took that game with this player making the game-winning shot. So as the years passed, more history and rules were being made for women's basketball. Like in 1916, coaches were only allowed to coach during halftime, and absolutely 0 timeouts or substitutions were allowed. Not sure what the thought process behind this change was, but moving on. By 1953, Team USA won its first ever gold medal. Then in 1976, the Olympics included its first ever women's basketball tournament. And by 1997, we had the inaugural season of the WNBA, which means it was not until recent that the players getting drafted were kids who actually grew up their whole lives being able to have dreams of playing in the WNBA. But before we talk more about the WNBA, let's take a look at NCAA college basketball and the beloved March Madness tournament that brought in millions of new fans this season for plays like this, records being broken, and history being made. The term March Madness first became associated with the NCAA tournament in 1982, but it was not until 2022 that the women were allowed to use March Madness in their marketing and branding. Ultimately, the Division I Women's Basketball Oversight Committee wanted to use this new opportunity as one of the first steps to achieving greater equity. But unfortunately, things fell short. The uproar started when a photo was posted comparing the weight room setup for the men competing in the tournament versus the women. This discrepancy had some big names speaking up. Following the backlash, NCAA's vice president put out a statement attributing the discrepancy to space limitations, which a player then proved to not be true. But the discrepancies did not stop there. More photos were released showing the difference in food and swag bags for the men versus the women. Some attributed this to the lack of revenue the women were bringing in when compared to the men, but others claimed that Title IX should come into play, requiring training equipment to be equal. However, the U.S. Supreme Court ruled in a court case from 1999 that the NCAA was not bound by Title IX. I know, interesting, right? But the tides are finally turning. This year, a record number of people tuned in to watch the women's championship game. But not only that, the women also broke 6 other viewership records this year. But why was this year different than past years? A huge part of it is the star players this tournament had, such as Caitlin Clark, who was a walking bucket, Angel Reese, the 2024 SEC Player of the Year, Paige Bueckers, a fan favorite from UConn, and amazing freshmen like Malaysia Fulwiley and Juju Watkins. But a few other factors that are contributing to the success we are seeing is that, first, social media has taken over the sports world like never before. With teams creating TikTok pages and more content, fans have been able to build a more personal bond with their favorite players and universities. NIL deals also allow players to build their brands and become more visible through things like sponsorships and endorsements. Second, people like the trash talk and grit that has been rising on the women's side. It makes for good storylines, passionate fans, and fun basketball games. And of course, there's also the increase of streaming services. Due to this increase, women's sports has become more accessible to watch. And lastly, these levels of success can ultimately be attributed to Title IX being passed back in 1972. When opportunities are finally granted to women, good things will happen. There is no longer just one or two powerhouses across the country. There are now several teams with outstanding programs and outstanding fan bases. But I was interested in seeing if this momentum in college women's basketball and its impacts would have longevity to it. Therefore, to look into this, I decided to look at past viewership numbers. After making a scatter plot for the viewership numbers of all past NCAA Division I women's basketball championships that I could find, I was able to take away a few key things. First, prior to 2020, the graph shows no outstanding positive or negative trend. However, after 2020, there was a clear positive trend. Now, for the purpose of my research, I decided to make a scatter plot of just the last 10 years. I personally thought looking at just the past 10 years would take into consideration the confounding variables mentioned earlier, such as the rise of social media, more accessibility to watch games, and more legitimate efforts being put into marketing and branding. Now with this scatter plot, I did some math so that I would be able to predict the amount of views next year's championship game would have. And after doing all of this, my calculations predicted the amount of viewers for next year's championship game would be around 12 million. So let's talk about it. At first glance, this seems wrong given almost 19 million people tuned into this year's championship game. But given our data set, this number is viewed as an outlier that can be in part explained by the amount of star power this season's biggest names had. But there is no guarantee that next year's stars will hold the same weight. But of course, I hope they do. And I think there is definite potential. So will this prediction hold true? Let's just say I can't wait to talk about this again next year to find out. Now, some fear that the hype surrounding college women's basketball this year would not flow over into the WNBA. But so far, this is not the case. The Indiana Fever have gained over 110,000 followers. Angel Reese's WNBA jersey was selling before preseason games even started. The Dallas Wings are relocating to a stadium that has more seat capacity and is easily accessible through public transportation. And for the first time ever, WNBA teams are selling out of their season ticket packages. And more games will be shown on national television than ever before. Furthermore, the WNBA has plans to expand to 14 teams by 2026 and to 16 teams by 2028. If you are wondering how many teams the WNBA currently has, the answer is 12. And for context, the NBA has 30 teams, which means only 144 players are allowed to play in the WNBA. So unfortunately, amazing players that carry fan bases with them have a high chance of being cut each year after getting drafted. But if more teams are added to the WNBA, this could also help boost the value of the league's next media rights deal. And with some saying the WNBA is looking to unbundle some of its media rights from those sold jointly with the NBA, and the current deals expiring next year, this new change could be huge if done effectively. But we'll have to wait for 2025 to see how this will play out. Ultimately, for years, women athletes have been told to go back to the kitchen and that nobody watches women's sports. But as the numbers have shown and the shirts going viral say, everyone watches women's sports. And just because viewership rates in the past were low did not mean people did not want to watch, but rather that, quote, the lack of resources devoted to the women's game wasn't an inevitable consequence of the game's popularity. It was a choice. And that, in turn, suggested that it was possible to make a different choice. That if the women's game were treated with the same level of promotion and investment and hype as the men's game, people would watch it too. What's up, everyone? I hope you enjoyed this video. If so, leave a like and subscribe, and I would love to hear y'all's thoughts in the comments. Also, follow me on Instagram and let me know what topics y'all would want to hear about next.